in this episode of the Critical Oxygen podcast.
And if we have specific goal races and goal paces for that race, we start doing more stuff based on paces and output. Because at the end of the day, when we go to race, the thing we don't care about the physiology, like the physiology matters, but what matters is the output. Like if you're going to race, we care about how fast you could run. So that's how we're going to train as we get closer to the race. We have specific goal paces that you're trying to hit. We're going to train off pace, where early on we train on physiology.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Critical Oxygen podcast, where we help you optimize your physiology and maximize your athletic potential. I'm your host, Phil Batterson, and today we're joined by continuing guest host, Jonah Rosner, where we're going to answer the question, should you only be following a polarized training plan? Jonah, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me back. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, it's been fun. We haven't talked in a little while, and the New York Marathon happened and everything like that, so I want to get a quick rundown of how that went and what you were up to, throughout that entire week, because you're in New York, so you were obviously doing a lot of different events and whatnot.
Yeah. No, I was surprised too, honestly. It was exciting. I think that's probably why we haven't talked in a while, like the week leading up to the marathon. It was much crazier than I expected, which was cool. Made me realize that people are starting to respect some of the stuff we're doing in regards to like the applied science standpoint, where last minute I got invited to a lot more dinners and events than I probably should have been invited to, if I'm being honest. But it was a really good time, made a lot of good connections.
Cool.
Yeah, that was my first New York City Marathon because I haven't been back in a while, but it was unbelievable, super inspirational just to see all the different people running for different causes, whether it was elite performance or just to complete, which was super cool. And yeah, unbelievable experience. I love the marathon weekends.
Yeah, that's awesome. I haven't been a part of too many of like the big marathons because I haven't lived in like those big cities and stuff where they take place, but I always see tons and tons of people. It's like dinners, and you have like the athletes come in, and then you have you have the people who are like the elite of the elite, right, that are competing in like the New York City Marathon, because that's like a big deal to win. But then you also have I saw something today that was like, the last 10 finishers of the marathon, and it was like people finishing around 12 hours, and I was like, oh my gosh, like that, talk about a long day.
Yeah, I mean, there's some people who walk and do a lot of different complete in a lot of different ways, which is really cool to see.
Yeah what was the coolest thing, biggest takeaway from this weekend for you?
I think just the culture of running, honestly, man, and how much it's blown up and how much excitement there is around it. That was my biggest takeaway.
Yeah, it really is. It's cool because I get to talk to you, who is ingrained in like the marathon community. I get to talk to Aaron Geyser, who is really ingrained in like the Ironman community. And it seems like all of those communities, truly are communities where people are supporting each other, whether you're super fast or not the fastest person, like everybody is extremely supportive, and it's really cool to see, because that just helps lift everybody else up at the end of the day within, all of those communities and stuff.
Yeah.
It's empowering.
It's a very unique experience for me, because obviously before this, I was at a different level of sport where it's just the elites. And the elites are on this pedestal, and if you don't play the sport at that level, you just don't play the sport at that point in your life. Right. But this is unique in regards to, we have elites running the exact same event or the same sport as people who are finishing in 12 hours, as you alluded to. But everyone's supporting everyone. It's like the first time I've ever been part of a sporting event like that, which is really cool.
Yeah, that's really cool. It always makes you want to go back, and I'm sure you're going to get that support too when you go and do Philly at the end of November, right?
Oh man, it made me want to rip for sure. The next day, I went out there. I think you saw on my Instagram too, and I wasn't planning on doing this, but I woke up and I was like, I'm just going to go for it, because I needed to do a peak week workout, which the marathon kind of put a damper in since the roads were closed, so I had to do it the next day. And I just decided to go for it and did 18 miles at like a 6:35 pace, which was out of body experience for my current fitness. And 4 months ago, not running at all to that is I don't know, maybe someone's been sneaking some EPO in my water. It's the only explanation.
That's the key.
That's I don't think I could have run 1 mile in 6:35 like 6 months ago, so
yeah, that's cool. Awesome, man. Well, hopefully that bodes well for your actual performance coming up in Philly then.
Yeah, I mean, I could run I'm at the point now, like I can run like a 250 or I can run like a 345. So we'll just see what happens.
Yeah. I mean, and that's actually kind of a great juxtaposition, is that, you can you can optimize your training, and you can
You could have
have,
one bad day.
yeah, exactly. You can have, like the best workouts of your life and stuff like that. But performing on the given day is, really what it kind of comes down to, especially if you are pursuing performance.
Yeah,
But by training optimally, you're kind of going to put yourself at better odds of, of hitting that 250 versus hitting, the 340 that you were talking about. But,
exactly.
it's, yeah. So that kind of brings, me to the big question of the day is, what is the best way to kind of go about training? And there's tons of debate on, oh, you need to do polarized training, or you need to do pyramidal training, or there's even people who do threshold training a lot. And for those of you who don't know, threshold training is a style of training where you're essentially doing mostly threshold work. So if you're in a 3-zone model, it's like zone 2. If you're in a 5-zone model, then it's zone 3. And it's what a lot of coaches would probably say is like more of that, like either gray zone training or junk miles. Yeah, I hear other people call it, but it's essentially, there, it is something that has worked for people in the past. But the big question is, what sort of training intensity distribution should we do? So Jonah, if you wouldn't mind giving us a definition of of polarized training, pyramidal training, and then we can kind of go from there, because there's been some really cool research that's recently come out that I think, flies in the
Yeah,
face of some of the recommendations that have been made, sweepingly over the last like 10 years or so.
yeah, it's definitely some murky waters in regards to the idea of periodization and training distribution
Mm-hmm.
program. But yeah, just quick definitions. We think about polarized versus pyramidal, which are probably the two most common ones you hear about in endurance sports.
Mm-hmm.
So if we split it up to that 3-zone model, as you alluded to, with your first or your first metabolic threshold, your second metabolic threshold, polarized training essentially just means that the majority of your workouts are going to occur below that first threshold, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then the next majority, or then another larger amount, is going to occur above that second threshold, so in that third zone. And then the least amount of training is going to occur in that second zone, in between the first and second metabolic threshold in polarized training. So essentially, the way it works is zone 1 is the most amount of training, zone 3 is the next amount, and then zone 2 occurs the least amount of training in a polarized
Mm-hmm.
model. They
Mm-hmm.
kind of like avoid the zone 2 area, if you will, just for a basic definition. Where
Yep.
pyramidal training, similar base, which is interesting, that commonality, how the most amount of training occurs below zone 1, but then the main difference is zone 2, you have more training than zone 3. So essentially, most of the training zone 1, zone 2, and then zone 3 occurs the least amount of training time.
Yep. Yeah, and the big idea of, or where this idea that polarized training is probably the most, economical or best to develop your, fitness over time, comes from, is that there were researchers who started to study, elite level marathoners, Tour de France cyclists, and what they did is they tried to quantify their training intensity over the course of a year, over the course of a season. And then what they saw is that essentially 80+% of that volume was occurring below zone 1. So we're talking about a 3-zone model here. So, if you're in a 5-zone model, that would be below zone 2, or at or below zone 2. And then they were doing a lot of work at or above zone 3. So VO2 max work, sprint, or high intensity interval work, sprint interval work, those sort of things. So that brought along this idea that, oh, I need to start training like the pros, and to get, to optimize my training response and everything like that. And in order to do that, I need to do 80% of my work at lower intensity and 20% of my work at higher intensity. um that sparked so much debate within the world. Is like, oh, well, is it based on, is it your sessions? Like, should you do one session a week that's, if you work out 5 times a week, should you do one session a week that's high intensity, and then the other 4 sessions are easy? Should you quantify it by heart rate? Should you quantify it by power? What should you do? Should you quantify it by RPE? And, because each one of those could potentially give you slightly different distributions based on, those intensities and where those, different thresholds are actually occurring at. So do you want to add anything to that idea of where polarized training actually came from?
No, I mean, I think you pretty much hit the nail on the head. That's exactly my understanding as well.
Yeah. And so that, I mean, it's echoed by, like the health community. Peter Attia is a huge proponent of, of this polarized training where, he recommends a lot of zone 2 work and then a lot of high intensity interval work. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. I don't think, I think you can get very fit. You can certainly get very physiologically fit by doing something like that. But where I kind of pause is I think it's a little bit, it simplifies training too much, where it's like, oh,
Exactly.
I'm just going to focus on easy and then hard every single day. And then you don't even think about what your,
Yeah.
race goal is or anything like that.
Yeah, I think if I could summarize it very quickly, the reason I'm not a huge fan, or I have polarized training models at different times of the year or based on different athletes, but the reason why I feel polarized training misses the boat is a lot of these distance events, like a marathon, half marathon, etc., take place between the first and second metabolic threshold.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that. And we know that we know that something that's extremely important in periodization is specificity of training to the event
Yep.
demands. So if your event occurs between that first and second metabolic threshold, you better do some training there before the event. And to do that, that's gonna need to have been in that gray zone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if you're not doing training in that race specific intensity, you're going to set yourself up for things um like cramping during the race, or not fully realizing that potential because your body has not become accustomed to running at whatever speed that is. And I'm speaking from experience here, where I was like, oh, I'll just do sprint treadmill work in the mornings when I train, and then I'll go and I'll do a long workout once a week, and then I'll try to get as much kind of steps in as I possibly can. So I was essentially doing mainly zone 2 work with some sprint interval work, and then I was going to race like an 18 miler, kind of like flat undulating trails, and sure enough cramped at like the 16-mile mark, and it was absolutely miserable, and I kept banging my head against the wall being like, what the heck is going on? Like, I keep cramping
Yeah.
up during these
Well,
races, and
I
I
don't
think it's
even,
because it wasn't
yeah,
specific.
I think it's that, but you also got to think about like those physiological and neuromuscular adaptations that occur at specific demands, right?
Right.
It's like you want to teach your, like we have a lot of research that shows that your running economy or like you become most efficient at the paces you train at,
Mm-hmm.
right? So like those neuromuscular adaptations that occur there, specific like fatigue resistance adaptations that occur like in the type 2A muscle fibers or whatever between that first and second metabolic threshold. So if you want to get your body to be the most efficient at working at your race pace, you have to train there. That's the best way to improve your running economy at that race pace.
Yep. Yeah,
It's a lot of
exactly.
specificity.
Yep. It's the law of specificity. So then the question becomes, okay, well, zone 2 training, okay, it's probably still beneficial because you can develop things like your VO2 max, you can develop a base, and we know that developing a large base and accumulating volume is important for developing athletes overall. But then the question becomes, okay, well, if I can't do if I can't do my polarized training, then what do I do? And what's your approach with this, Jonah? And we have talked about this on the podcast a number of times, but I just want you to reiterate kind of like how you go about, like, so for example, if I came to you and was like, hey, I want to run a marathon in November, and it's January, like, what sort of approach would you take to that?
Yeah. It definitely does a lot of contextual factors that I think go into play, but a lot of it's like their training history, what kind of training they've done beforehand, training age, so we know what kind of volume and intensities they can handle, all those different things where they are physiologically. But I would say there's a few rules that are steadfast laws to me that apply in any periodization, which is general to specific. And
Mm-hmm.
again, that law of specificity, making sure there's some elements of specific training. My periodization has been heavy, like if in it's heavy influenced by like a funnel methodology, I would say, like that general to specific, where you start at paces faster than marathon performance, paces slower than marathon performance, and then you slowly funnel in. So both sides of it get closer and closer to marathon performance. So the speed work gets slower, gets closer to marathon pace. That base work gets slightly faster, closer to marathon pace. And all the different elements of like VO2 max stimulus or like an endurance base, speed work is present throughout the year, but how much volume and what we emphasize is different based on where we are relative to the race. So as we get closer to the race, like we'll do a VO2 max session maybe once every 2 or 3 weeks because it's not as specific. It's still present, but like all the threshold, there's a lot more threshold work as we get more specific to the race. So I think if we're connecting it back to some of these topics we've been talking to, the way my typical model would probably start is maybe it's a little more polarized at first as we're far away from the race, where there's a lot of base work. First, we start off with a ton of easy base work. We sprinkle in some sprinting stuff, some very higher, or not sprinting, but higher intensity speed work, maybe a little threshold work. And then as you get closer and closer to the race, people will notice, oh, it's a lot more threshold work or a lot more volume at work that's faster in between that first and second threshold. So some of that work in there, but longer durations. And it's all just in preparation to get you more specific to the race demands, I would say. So it probably starts off a little more polarized at first, maybe. And then as we get closer, it probably gets actually more pyramidal.
Yeah.
That's typically how I go about it.
That's exactly how I would approach things with individuals as well. And I think that's what a lot of really good coaches actually do is, they don't just say, okay, well, polarized training seems to be what all, elite level endurance athletes do. Therefore, I need to do only polarized training with my athletes. It's like, no, you need to have the law of specificity here, and you need to have progression within that specificity as well. And further out, you can go from general, which is why we see, people in the base season, base training time go from, pretty high volume at pretty low intensities with a few high intensity days, maybe to, when you like, I'm sure you're building up, for that marathon, and just like that 18 that you did the other day was probably pretty close to marathon pace. Like it wasn't.
Yeah, it was very close to goal marathon pace, but like a long run earlier on would have been a lot slower.
Right.
So that's
you're just
like
trying
really
to get the miles
microcosm.
in. Yeah, you're just trying to get the miles in when you first start, and now you're like, okay, well, I gotta hone the blade of this sword.
Yeah, exactly. So when I first start, it's about like getting the miles or the accumulation of volume to get myself to where the mileage I want to hold throughout my marathon prep. And then as we get closer, the miles get faster, essentially. So the volume may actually slightly go down in terms of mileage, but the speeds are closer to marathon. So a lot of the miles are slightly faster, I would say.
Yeah.
Or just closer to marathon prep.
Yeah. So from a technology perspective, or like how you were monitoring intensities, how does that shift throughout the year? Because I imagine, like, I kind of have some ideas, but I want to know if your ideas are kind of the same way as mine.
I think I periodize the ways that I use technology or the way I go about programming very similarly, where I view the physiological basis in my mind is the physiological basis gives us the general support for the speeds we want to run in a marathon. So I take a very physiology heavy approach in the general prep phase when we're first getting started. That means a lot of technology, and that means a lot of training based on where you're at. So a lot of monitoring with lactate, a lot of monitoring with NIRS. That way we're very specific with the physiological stimulus we're giving you, because the goal during those base phases is to raise the roof on key physiological stimuluses. Raise like your first threshold. Then as we move closer, work on raising your second threshold. But as we get closer and closer to the race, I would say the technology actually gets pulled out a little bit. And if we have specific goal races and goal paces for that race, we start doing more stuff based on paces and output. Because at the end of the day, when we go to race, the thing we don't care about the physiology, like the physiology matters, but what matters is the output. Like if you're going to race, we care about how fast you could run. So that's how we're going to train as we get closer to the race. We have specific goal paces that you're trying to hit. We're going to train off pace, where early on we train on physiology.
Yep. Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And I think, as simple, it's not simple, but as straightforward as that sounds, I still think there's a lot of people out there who are like, well, I just train by heart rate all year round, or I just train by power output all year round. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I do think that if you're trying to optimize your training, focusing on the physiology in the beginning, seeing what your heart rate is doing, seeing how your lactate values are changing or your NIRS values are changing, and running or exercising to elicit the correct physiological stimulus at the beginning of the season is important because that's what you're targeting. Whereas as you get closer to that race, performance is based on how fast you can get across that finish line. It doesn't matter what your heart rate is during that finish line, what your lactate values are, anything like that. Obviously, there's some level of pacing that might be useful for, say, like beginners or people who have a tendency to go out way too hard and then crash. But you should start to feel, oh, 6:30 pace is maintainable for me for a long, for 18 plus miles. Or, ooh, it's not really maintainable for me. So is that really a realistic marathon goal that I have? So yeah, I think that's also that's super interesting. It's periodize, both the distribution of your training intensities, but also periodize the use of technology throughout the season.
Exactly.
And
I
so
think it's even
periodize everything.
like the way I look at it, if I could summarize it in one sentence, is early on it's a physiology based approach. What the internal response is going to be, and as we get closer to the race, it's about output.
Yep.
It's an output based response. It's about speeds.
Yeah. And I think too that's actually that's a really good point, and it kind of plays into the paper that you and I were discussing offline. It's a paper that was published in Frontiers in Physiology, or Frontiers in Sports and Active Living, which is a Frontiers in Physiology based open source journal. But the title is "The Proportional Distribution of Training by Elite Endurance Athletes at Different Intensities During Different Phases of the Season." And one of the big things that I think people miss is that even though the elite level athletes seem to be doing polarized training all year round, they're actually not. And what this paper tried to do is try to show or try to illustrate that by taking into account a number of different, they call it TIDs, training intensity distributions, and how they're measuring it. So this paper is really cool because they say, okay, well, there were TIDs that were heart rate based, there were ones that were power based, there were ones that were speed based, and then based on that, you actually get different training distributions in correspondence to whatever you're measuring. So sometimes they're physiological, other times they're more mechanical output, like more your performance variable output. But if I could summarize a lot of data, because they looked at a ton of different training intensity distributions, if I could summarize a lot of data really quickly, is that the longer the event, the more polarized your training starts. So in the base building phase, and then it gets more specific. So exactly what Jonah was saying, right, is towards the competition phase of things, you get more into that threshold work, maybe a little bit under threshold, but you're bringing up that low end speed, your quote unquote zone 1 or zone 2, whatever models you're thinking about, you're bringing that speed up, and then you're bringing your interval speed down. So you're actually kind of funneling what your outputs are. Whereas in the beginning of the season, you're more worried about just, simply getting in volume and then keeping that high intensity gear, still engaged, developing that VO2 max, because you're probably not going to be, you're definitely not going to be developing VO2 max to the same extent towards the end of the season.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that was my main takeaway from it too. It's essentially that there was a few key points. Most endurance training, the commonality we do see is that zone 1. So that's important to learn from. That it's a lot of easy volume work is the commonality. Mm-hmm. But there's no magic pill after that. And that it seems like the athletes who have the most success, first of all, we need to get better at defining like all these different training intensities distributions was the takeaway for me. But number 2 are the ones who periodize. That they change the distribution based on where they are in the time of the year, which is what you were just alluding to.
Yeah, exactly. And, and you were saying this in an earlier podcast episode where, one of the biggest challenges you have or you see with the running community is that people go out and they run the same pace every single day. And it's one of those things where that is the antithesis of either polarized or pyramidal training. Like you're just doing what we defined as maybe threshold training, right? Because you're not exercising easy enough for it really to be kind of deemed that like zone 1 or zone 2 kind of recovery sort of style training where you can accumulate a lot of volume, but you're not exercising hard enough to increase your like things like VO2 max threshold, because it's under both of those. So then what you end up doing is you end up kind of spinning your wheels. And I think that is a pitfall that a lot of us have, especially if your goal is performance. You have to drop the ego, stop looking at Strava and what other people are doing and say, okay, what's best for my body on this given day? And, if it's, I need to go easier, then go easier. And, that's something that where I think like things like physiological variables, heart rate, near infrared spectroscopy, lactate values to some extent are useful, right? Because they give you an indication, oh, my body is working really hard for whatever output that I'm trying to get it to do. And I see all the time people being like, oh, well, my or heart rate, like heart rate changes based on if it's hot outside, if I'm dehydrated, if I'm fatigued or other things like that. Therefore, you shouldn't use heart rate. I'm just like, no, that's actually one of the reasons why you should use heart rate, is because it's telling you how your physiology is responding to all the different factors that are
Yeah,
affecting your body internally, not just speed and not just power.
exactly, man. No, I couldn't agree more. I try to get everyone out here to weigh heart rate because for me, it is really important to understand what's happening from an external standpoint, the output, but we want to know the physiological cost.
Mm-hmm.
And that can change based on the day to day. That could be a good indicator of fatigue or a good indicator where we need to change the workout to make sure we're actually getting the desired adaptation we're going for.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've worked with a number of athletes who are like, who I try to convince them, okay, you got to go easier. You got to go easier. And if you're somebody who is against going easier, first of all, I would just implore you to kind of dig a little deeper. Why is that? Why is that? Right. But then I would also just ask you, okay, well, if you do 2 weeks of easier training, would you be like 2 weeks of easier training? How is that going to change your physiology, your output, how you feel about training and all of that? Because worst case scenario, you do 2 weeks of that, everything just goes to shit. And then you just go back to training the exact same way that you were training. But I can almost guarantee you that if you do the 2 weeks of easier training, you're going to feel better. You're going to sleep better. Your high intensity work is going to be better. You're going to be able to absorb that high intensity work better. And then, you're going to be able to progress and actually be faster, because that's one of the, yeah, that's one of the most annoying things as a runner, is that, you put in all this time and effort, you go running every single day, and then you don't get better on race day. Like, talk about like a futile effort.
Exactly. I think I had a really well known coach say it to me the other day, who I respect a lot for, and he said it's like they can't absorb the training. And you
Mm-hmm.
have to teach them that they need these easier runs so they can absorb that intense training.
Yeah, exactly. And again, it depends on where you're at in the season. It depends on, like it depends on a lot of things, but that also opens up the door for reasons why having a great coach, or just a coach in general, is important, because they're going to be looking at your performances. They're going to be looking at how you're progressing or not progressing, and they're going to say, okay, well, I want you really to focus on heart rate for, say, like easier workouts, and then I really want you, but on the flip side of things, I really want you to focus on speed for VO2 max workouts, right? And is building in that nuance. And sometimes I think as a lot of us who probably listen to this show are type A individuals who want to control everything. And one of the things that happens when you try to control everything and don't give somebody else outside viewing of what you're doing is that you overestimate your ability to take on stress, to do workouts, to do other things like that. So just having another eye or lens on things is really important, for your continued progression. Yeah. So anything else on, I think we covered, pretty much everything. We have a little bit of a shorter episode today, but I think we covered everything we really wanted to, just talking about this myth that you have to do polarized training all the time. But it really comes down to polarized training kind of in the off season, switching to more specific training as you get closer to your races or your goal race. And then, kind of going in and out of that periodically throughout the year. That's going to give you the most potential for success.
Yeah, no, I mean, I couldn't agree more. That's essentially my summary of it as well. Just have some element of periodization throughout, general to specific, and there's no really one right periodization or one right intensity distribution.
Yeah. Yeah, it's all, at the end of the day, the best coaches are going to individualize everything for you as the individual, and they're going to take into account what your stress is, what your training age is, everything else you do outside of the gym, all of that. And the goal, right? The tagline of this podcast is teaching individuals how to optimize their physiology to maximize their potential. We're giving you tools to hopefully think and problem solve a little bit more, rather than just blindly follow, say, I did polarized training for a year and this is what happened, some of those YouTube videos. And I'm not saying, I think for a lot of people it could be beneficial, but you're going to be leaving potential gains on the table if that's all you're doing and you're just following one training intensity distribution.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, cool. Well, with that, we'll wrap it up. You can find me at Critical02 on Instagram. You can find Jonah on Instagram at Jonah_JAR Performance. If you have any questions or comments, direct them to us on Instagram, or comment down below if you're on YouTube, and we'll catch you guys in the next one.